All right, so we're now on week 5, and I want to thank you all for joining us in this class. And just want to get this back. I believe I miscued it, so let me just put it back. There you go. I am going to cue this back. Sorry about that. There you go. Okay, so we'll share the screen now. Okay, so week 5, this is the Imperial Church. We started with the church in the empire, but at this point, the church will now become part of the empire. It's not just in the empire being persecuted, being affected. It's going to now become part of the empire. And you'll understand what I mean as we go on to this. So first, we're going to take a look at what happened in the past from the 2nd century to the 3rd century. We know that the church has been undergoing persecutions, and it's not a general persecution. What they're trying to do, the Roman Empire, is they're trying to allow the Christian church to persist or survive in the empire. Because it's basically a good religion. Like they meet on Sundays, they ask people not to commit sin, not to steal, to be good to one another. So it's pretty much a good force in society. The only problem, though, is they do not worship the idols. They do not worship the Roman gods and goddesses. And whenever the Roman Empire enters into a problem, whenever they feel that they're having issues with power, they would equate that with the gods and goddesses of the Roman culture to be not blessing them because the people are not worshiping them enough. And so they would look at the Jews and the Christians and would start to persecute them if somebody raises a point that they're not, they are Christians and they're not worshiping the Roman gods and goddesses. And if they insist on that, then they're going to be killed. But if somebody does not say anything against them, they would survive. So that's what's happening in the 2nd and 3rd century. But in the 4th century, that's going to have a change. It's actually starting in late in the 3rd century because the church was growing. It's being persecuted, but the society is seeing these people and thinking something's different with them. They don't commit crimes. They love one another. They're very helpful. So something must be going on. And they would start asking about the Christian faith. And so pretty much there will be Christians in the army. There will be Christians in the senators, in the Senate. There would be Christians in different parts of the upper echelon of the society in Rome. And so slowly the change is coming. And by the 4th century, this is really, really strong. So here's what's happening during that time. The church was really simple. One of the things that they would do is they would worship on Sunday. So the Jews were doing Sabbath. The Christians, because they're celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, they started celebrating on Sunday. Contrary to what others have said, that the communion or the Sunday thing was mandated by Constantine. That's not the case. Even before Constantine, the church was starting to worship on Sundays. They started doing the Lord's Supper. This is the very reason why they meet on Sunday. Acts 20 says, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, this is Luke who was speaking. He was describing what Paul did. And Paul also preached on that Sunday. If you recall, in Acts 20, this is the preaching that was so long. There was one person in the portico of the church that fell asleep and fell, and he died. And Paul raised this person up to be alive again. That was on the first day of the week when they gathered together. Um, it's also important then they preached the word. So they were preaching the word. That's the one of the things that would happen. So they celebrate the Lord's Supper. There is a discussion of scripture or the story of Jesus. But somehow, over time, in the Protestant church later, in many cases, it says there, the common practice now is to focus on preaching rather than on communion. So, what do we mean by this? Well, in the early church, meeting on Sunday and having communion on Sunday is really the regular thing. But now there are churches where they would say, when you do communion every Sunday, it loses significance. And so what they would do is they would do communion once a month or once a quarter or maybe twice a year, because the focus is now on preaching, and communion becomes something that is uh, kind of like a special occasion only on a few times a year. Now, their idea would sound good in the sense that, hey, we don't want it to become passe. That's why we're creating special events over that. We do it at certain times of the month or times of the year. The problem with that reasoning is what do you do with prayer? If we pray every day, it's going to become passe. No wonder others have this memorized prayer and they say it almost like a drone, like they don't mean it. It's almost like automatic. Those of you who pray when you enjoy dinner or a meal, you'd notice that many of our kids have this memorized prayer about eating. So is it possible that it has become a drone? So why not stop praying? Maybe just pray once a month, once a year, once a quarter. I think the answer is we still pray every day because we want to commit to this conversation with God daily. The same way with the Lord's Supper, uh, Apostle Paul said that they do it every first day of the week. Why change it? Just go to what Scripture is saying. So this is the pattern in the third century church. They were celebrating the Lord's Supper. What else? There's now a change from apostles to local elderships. So the apostles started losing their lives towards the end of the first century. And so by the third century, the apostles are no longer there. It's a good thing that they started to write the New Testament books that we now have as letters to churches, recording of the Gospels, and then they appointed elders, leaders in the local church. And you would see this in Titus 1:5, for example. Paul was saying to Titus, put what remain into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. In fact, in Titus 1, beginning from verse 5 to 16, are the qualifications of eldership. So that's basically the pattern. So no archbishops, no pope, no cardinals yet during this time. It's just local elders. It's what you would call local autonomy. There's no like center of power at this point. It was just the apostles, and then as the apostles died, it was the local elders that they have appointed. There are other terms in the New Testament that you would see, the words deacons or deaconesses, women in ministry. Uh, there would be those cases. Yes, it is predominantly male, but there are also female who have the role in the church. A few examples of this would be Phoebe, who was named as a deacon. You see this in Romans 16:7, and in that part, like for example, it says, "Greet Andronicus and Junia." Junia is a female as well. We would know this because of the name. Junia is a Greek female name. Uh, it's very seldom that it would be used for a man. And when you talk about Andronicus and Junia, you can imagine Priscilla and Aquila, who were husband and wife, and they led Paul to know more about the faith when after his confrontation with Jesus in the road to Damascus. So you would see here, greet Andronicus and Junia, my compatriots and my fellow prisoners. They are well known to the apostles. So um, you could see here that Junia is also being esteemed as somebody who is worthy enough to be known to the apostles. So there's role for women during that time in ministry. Now, why do we not see this often now? Well, there was a point in the church history where some women led the church to apostasy and heresy. And after that, Paul started to um, ask that make sure that in churches, if possible, that the men are leading it and that the women should submit to the men in such a case. But it's not necessarily a word to say that women have no place in church, because like I said, Phoebe is there, Junia is there, Aquila is there. There are even female prophets in the book of Acts. So that's the pattern of the church in the third century. What else do we see in the third century? Well, worship meetings were happening in homes and catacombs. Now, um, if the church is growing, of course, and they have small homes, they couldn't meet there. Now, they couldn't at this point build buildings specifically for churches. So, what they would do is they would use catacombs, because societies are allowed. Christians can band as a society and buy a piece of land and make that their cemetery. And then during that time, the cemetery would be a catacomb, like an underground chamber where burials are happening. And they would also do services there. They would do their Sunday service there. They actually feel they're closer to the martyrs of the faith because their bodies, their corpses are there. So that's what's happening. Church finances, it's coming just from members and donors, similar to our pattern today. There are also the rise of apologists, thinkers, and teachers. So because there's many heresies coming, many intrigues about the church being the cannibalistic religion, because they have the communion and they say, flesh and blood of Jesus. So they're probably cannibals. They're probably doing sexual orgies because they call their husbands and wives sisters and brothers. So they're having incest. So there's this rise of theologians and thinkers. Now, mind you, it does not mean that all the apologists and thinkers have it all right. One example here is Gregory of Nyssa, who kind of explained the faith of how salvation works. What does Jesus do when he died on the cross? What does being a ransom for many mean when it was described in scripture? In his mind, it was like this: the deity, meaning the divinity of Jesus, was hidden under the veil of our nature. That's why he became a man. That so as with ravenous fish, the hook of the deity might be gulped down along with the bait of the flesh, and thus life being introduced into the house of death and light shining in darkness. Basically, what Gregory of Nyssa here was saying is that Jesus tricked the devil by pretending to be a normal bait. And when Jesus was swallowed up by the devil through death, Jesus defeated the darkness by resurrecting himself after 3 days. It's a great idea. The problem with this is God is not a deceiver. Only the devil is a deceiver. So this idea is actually faulty. But this is an example of how, apologists and thinkers in the church are starting to try and reason out, explain how salvation works. And sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. But this is what's happening during the third century church. And then there are other things. Now, there's the challenge of a growing church in the midst of a hostile culture. Um, you will see here the term catechumens. What does this mean? Well, during the time that the church was being persecuted, they decided to make sure that people truly know the gospel, truly know what Christianity means before they become baptized believers. So perhaps there's a poor description of what this would look like, but the Catholic Church has catechism wherein they teach the elements of the Catholic faith. So it's similar to that. Basically, if you want to become a Christian during this time, you cannot be baptized right away. What they do is they teach you the gospel, they teach you the faith. Note that many of these people who are turning to Christianity are not necessarily Jewish. They're Gentiles, so they don't know the Old Testament. And so they would teach them the concept of God, of Yahweh, of the promise to Israel, and how God honored this promise, and how Jesus was born. And normally it takes a year or two. And when the bishop or the elder who was training the catechumens feel that they can be trusted enough, that's the only time that they get baptized. And that's the only time that they are allowed to have the Lord's Supper. So it's not just a question of asking them to say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. It was a longer period. One reason that made this practical for them is because there are questionable writings that are coming out. The Gospel according to Thomas, the Gospel according to Judas, questionable writings called the what do you call it? The Gnostic writings. There are heresies happening. So the early church wanted the early Christians to be really taught on the faith. So there was the catechumenate, as they would call it. That's how they handle the challenge of growing, of a church growing in the midst of a hostile culture. There's also what you call a Catholic or inter-church consensus. So during this time, there's no Catholic church, but what they mean by the word Catholic is that all the churches agree. So different churches, there's no central government, but they're agreeing that, hey, these are the books that we're reading. As far as the Gospels are concerned, it's only Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As far as the writings of Paul are concerned, these are the only ones. So the 27 books of the New Testament, majority of the churches agree based on inter-church consensus. And during that time, the term that was used is Catholic, meaning to say agreed by the churches. Later on, this meaning would change as as the Christian church becomes a church that is strongly influenced by the empire. There are also tensions in authority and complex issues of persecutions. We talked about this last week. During the time of persecution, there were people who were being martyred. They would not deny Christ. They would be asked 3 times to deny Christ and offer sacrifices to the gods. If they don't do this, then they die. So those would be the martyrs. But towards the end, the Roman Empire decided to not murder them, but try to convert them. And so what they would do is they would ask them to worship, offer things to the Roman gods and goddesses. And if they do that, they're being given a certificate. And so there are Christians who do not necessarily are willing to offer sacrifices, but they bribe Roman guards so that they could get certificates. So later on, these people and those who offered sacrifices and were given certificates, of course, survived the persecution, and they're called the lapsed ones. What do we do with this? There are those who were called because they're not being murdered now because the society, Roman Empire, don't want to kill them anymore as much as possible. They just want them to become practitioners of worshiping the Roman gods and goddesses. They call it syncretism. You know, you can be a Christian if you also offer sacrifices to other gods. Uh, there are people who did not do that. They were tortured, but they were not murdered. They continue to um, proclaim Christ as their Lord and Savior. So they were called the confessors. Okay. And then there were the bishops or elders of the church. Some of them became confessors. Some of them were seen as lapsed ones only because while they did not offer sacrifices to the gods and goddesses, they escaped in areas of the empire where the persecution is not rampant or not brutal. And so when the persecutions would stop, the churches would congregate again, they would meet, and now they ask the question, so what do we do with the lapsed ones? And last week we talked about how confessors are really humble and forgiving. They're willing to accept the people who have lapsed. But many of the bishops, even those who hid during the persecution, did not want it that way. They want them to, the lapsed ones, before they can go back to the church, they would have to be like catechumens again. And only when they're about to die will they be accepted by by the church, by the bishops. So there was this tension of authority. Who do we listen to? Do we listen to the faithful ones, the confessors, or do we listen to the bishops, the elders, who some of them actually fled and hid? Eventually, the bishops gained ground only because the church wanted to respect the pattern that was established by the apostles, that there were appointed elders in the church. And so there's already this tension happening in the church. What else is happening in the church? Let's take a look at the other things. So in the third century persecution, we mentioned this last week, a few of the names that you would see here. There is a thinking that only during the time of Constantine was there um, kindness to the Christians. Well, in a sense, Constantine institutionalized the kindness of the empire to the Christians. But even during the time of Alexander Severus and Philip the Arabian, there were already kindness to the Christians. In fact, Philip was believed to have been a secret Christian believer himself. And so that's why there was a weakness of the persecutions. There's some gaps, and that was good for the church. There's a little breathing space. Same thing with Alexander Severus. He was also kind. There was an idea that some of his relatives are also Christians. And so there was a brief rest there. But then the persecution grew again with Decius. And then we go into the latter part of the third century, where there were so many wars that took away the attention of the empire on the Christians. There was a little rest until the time that Diocletian came into power in the 4th century. So early in the 4th century, a guy by the name of Diocletian, who apparently was a strong and intelligent leader, became one of the emperors. During this time, there were so many infighting, because the way you become an emperor is either you're a son of the current emperor, or if the current emperor has no son, it would be his second in command. So when he dies, the second in command in the army would become the inheritor. But there was a point in time towards the end of the 3rd century that there were so many aspirants to the throne. So there were so many assassinations, infighting. And so one solution that they found out is to have 4 instead of 1 emperor. So the idea is there would be 2 Augustus. So the 2 Augustus would be the higher than the other 2. And then there would be 2 Caesars. the two Caesars would be under the two Augustus. So in the case of Diocletian, he was handling the east of the empire, and under him, Diocletian is the Augustus. Under him is Galerius, who was a Caesar. And then on the west side, so this would be towards Europe, towards Gaul, Great Britain, and so on. Maximian would be was the Augustus, and then Constantius Chlorus, who is the father of Constantine, was his Caesar, and this was in the west. Now, initially, Diocletian was friendly to the church. The reason being is because his wife and daughter were actually Christians. So he was initially supportive of the Christian church. So again, even before Constantine, during Diocletian's time, it started initially as a friendly administration to the Christians. The problem was during this point, Christianity was growing so much to the point that there were so many Christians who are in the military, who are in the middle level of society. And then there was this strong discussion in the churches about Christians not participating in war. In other words, it's almost like pacifism. And this became a threat to the Roman Empire. And so Galerius, the Caesar of Diocletian, influenced Diocletian to launch a persecution against Christians who would refuse to fight. You would note that during this time there are the revolts and attacks by the barbarians in the borders of the empire. So they needed the army. But if the army is not going to fight, this is a huge problem. So they started to boot out people in the military if they're Christians. However, Galerius also realized that if this happens, they're going to have a smaller army. So they changed this to a persecution wherein they are trying to force the Christians in the military to deny the faith. And they're being asked to offer sacrifices to the gods and goddesses. If they don't, they murder them. They persecute, they actually martyr them, basically. And they also, at some point, outlawed Christian worship. And during this time, it was Diocletian who was doing this persecution, and this was described as the most cruel that the ancient church had to endure. Why is this? Because now they're starting to burn sacred scripture. So in other words, if they get a Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, in their hands, they're going to burn those. It was outlawed. Worship is again not allowed. Christians are being killed. And then they also had an edict that Christians must offer to the gods. And Diocletian forced his wife and his daughter to do this. And of course, they survived. But most of the Christians did not. And so they were killed as well. So this was the most cruel persecution that is happening. But over time, Diocletian is growing old. He got sick. And Galerius, because he wanted to replace Diocletian, forced Diocletian and Maximian to retire. And so Galerius came to power. And then he appointed other people to replace Maximian, as well as the other two Caesars. But Maximian has a son by the name of Maxentius. Constantius has a son by the name of Constantine. Both of them are really popular in the military. And so the military did not listen to Galerius. People who were faithful to Constantius Chlorus swore allegiance to Constantine. And people who are faithful to Maximian swore allegiance to Maxentius. And so Maxentius and Constantine ruled the west of the empire. So this is now starting to become like an alliance. Constantine, in a switch, Constantine became kind of like the Augustus because he was more popular. And then on the other side of the western hemisphere of the empire, Maxentius was also ruling. And at this point, of course, they started to have battle. Diocletian was now farming. Maximian is now retired. Galerius led an army to march and attack Maxentius. But what happened is his army transferred their loyalty to Maxentius and some to Constantine. And so Galerius now had a smaller army. So there was an impasse. But this is now becoming the power of Constantine. Now, most of you are familiar with what happened next. Later on, the Constantinian era would start with this victory of Constantine in the Milvian Bridge. And the thing here is this. It did not happen first with his victory against Maxentius. What actually switched it is that somehow Diocletian got sick. And during the time that Diocletian was sick, others advised him that perhaps it is God's punishment because of him persecuting um, the, um, the Christians. And then they also thought that maybe it's the same thing with Galerius. Galerius got sick, and maybe it was because of the persecution that he is waging against the Christians. And so, in exchange for prayer, Galerius mandated a peace against Christianity. And he said something to the effect that um, the Christians, although they do not worship the idols, have been a peaceful group of people. And so the church will now experience the magnanimity of the empire. They are no longer going to persecute the Christians. In exchange, the Christians will pray for the Roman Empire. And so the Christians did pray for the Roman Empire, but a few days later, Galerius died. And historians would say that this was an act of God moving in the empire. Now, during this time, Constantine now had an opportunity to kind of like establish his strength. So his ally originally was Maxentius, but now he started waging war with Maxentius. And in the Battle of Milvian Bridge, of course, Maxentius died. The night before that, the claim was Constantine had a dream or a vision of the cross. And so he asked his soldiers to have the emblem of the cross in their armor, either on their shoulders or in their shields. And the story says that he won the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Maxentius drowned when he fell from the bridge and into the river, and his armor was too heavy for him to be able to swim back to the shore. And so Constantine now unified the West. Later on, he's going to get the East as well by defeating his brother-in-law who replaced Galerius, a guy by the name of Licentius, or Licinius, sorry. So that's the detail with the rise of Constantine in the empire. And this also made it very, very popular to have the sign of Christianity during that time, which is, of course, the cross. Later on, another sign would appear, and it was said to be patterned after the cross, and it is what you call the Cairo. You'll see it here at the lower end. And what you see here is actually the first two Greek letters of the name Christus. You see in the Greek, there's no CH. The CH is actually an X, which is read as key. And then the P that you see here is actually R. So it's a chi or a key, and then the R or the rho. So this is the Cairo or Kiro, which became the symbol similar to the cross. And you will see this nowadays in the staff that the Pope holds, wherein you would see the Cairo in the middle of the cross. So you'll see that this is a combination of the early Christian symbol and the cross that supposedly was seen by Constantine. So truly a Roman influence in this sense. But now the Constantinian, sorry about the typo here, Constantinian era has started. We're going now to see the power of the church. Slowly, it's going to be that case. Now, you would probably have to decide whether Constantine was a true believer or not. Others say that he wasn't. But one historian said it this way: Constantine was probably a sincere believer in the power of Christ. He may not see that power in the same way in which it had been experienced by those Christians who died for it. He probably sees the Christian God as very powerful, being who supported him as long as someone who would support him as long as he would support the church. And so it is probably the reason why he showed kindness to the church early on. He was, to the point of others, he was trying to win favor from the Christian God. And so doing, Constantine started to have laws in favor of Christianity. And when he had churches built, he would sought the goodwill of Christians. Not necessarily what he was looking for is the goodwill of their God. So that's the observation about Constantine. So what are the changes that Constantine brought? So here are a few. Before, if you're a Christian and you're in government position, you will be taken out of that position. You will be asked to recant or deny Christ. If not, you will die. But during Constantine's time, what he did is he started putting Christians, bishops in particular, or elders in particular, in high government positions. So now, Christians are getting power in policy making and so on. The other thing that he did is that I did mention that the Christians were already worshiping on Sunday, even before Constantine. But in Constantine's case, he created an edict in 324 CE, wherein the supreme God worship would be on Sunday. Now, Christians would think that, hey, so the supreme God is our God. But those who are not Christians would also have a supreme God. It is the unconquered Son, or Sol Invictus. And so even if you are not a Christian, you're still encouraged to worship the supreme God on Sunday. So that was one of the things that happened. And then, of course, the Council of Nicaea happened with imperial stamp. Remember, there was an issue over the deity of Christ. And there was an issue over what books to read. And there's been an early determination about the canon, but in the Council of Nicaea, they wanted to revisit that. And so that happened as well. And it was with imperial stamp, meaning to say, if you're a bishop or an elder of the church that was invited to the council, then you can stay in the imperial palace, in Roman palaces, in government facilities, and the empire is actually bankrolling the meeting. And of course, you would see here, this is an early picture of the bishops meeting in Nicaea. And you will see here a picture of Constantine dressed with imperial garb. And so were the bishops. They were also wearing imperial garbs. And you would note the cross as a significant symbol, because as far as Constantine is concerned, that is something that is important. And so the bishops are also doing the same. Now we are seeing the shift from the persecuted, the church being the persecuted, to becoming the dominant force in the empire. There are Christians in power. Christians are enjoying the favor of the emperor. And then the Roman religion shifts from being the state religion to the unfavored one. After Constantine has died, because of the things that he has set in motion, his successors also favored Christianity. And in 356 CE, the support of the Roman Empire for non-Christian religion was taken out. By 391 CE, there was an edict wherein non-Christian worship is not allowed in the empire. You're not allowed to offer sacrifices to idols. So now the Christian religion is the favored one. And in 305 CE, the persecuted becomes the persecutor. There are some Christian leaders and Christians in society, wherever they are, who started persecuting the Jews and killing them if they don't become Christians. The same thing happened to those who are non-Christians. If they don't become Christ worshiper, they will be killed. So it's almost the reverse of the Christian persecution. In 305 CE, I noted it here because this is important. One of the leaders of the church released an order that if a Christian dies while persecuting a non-Christian, the church should not declare this person as a martyr because they see this as a wrong application of the faith. So you would see the tension happening here, the problem that is arising. Another thing is the tax exemption for church properties. This started during the years after Constantine's reign, established by his successors. So tax exemption for church properties, this is still happening even in our time. This actually started during the time of the Constantinian era and after it. So this is the impact of the new order. There are various privileges for bishops or elders. For example, they are not required to do military service. They're not required to do the yearly labor that is mandated by the Roman Empire. They're also able to skip from paying taxes, so those things. And because of this humble role of Christian leaders has now become a coveted role. So what happens now? If you're somebody who is not a Christian, used to be a priest of a Roman religion that worships Athena or somebody else, one of the Roman gods and goddesses, well, you would want to be in this role. You would want to become a Christian elder or a bishop. So what do? You try to convert to Christianity. You try to become, snake your way into power. And so that you can do what you wanted to do again. Even other original, like really authentic Christian leaders became arrogant and corrupt. And so in the end, by the 4th and 5th century, the church pervaded the empire to the point that in our early study, we said that almost 50% of the empire were Christians. So now the church was a strong influence, but eventually the empire is now influencing the church because of the things that they're giving to the church. The church is now being changed from something that is simple to something that is grandiose, something that is luxurious, and eventually something that would be corrupt and arrogant. So that's a change that is happening in the empire. Now I noticed I did make a mistake on some of the slides. I doubled it up, so sorry for that. But here's one of the impact of the new order. Before, the Christians would be wearing simple clothes. It is the clothes of the masses. Even elders would have simple clothes. But because now they enjoy the favor of Constantine, you see the clothing of the imperial nobility becoming part of the church. And so now you start seeing elders wearing important colors, the color red or maroon, gold, royal blue. They would now have elegant clothing. You saw the picture a while ago of the council in Nicaea, wherein the bishops or elders were wearing imperial garb. This is one of the impact of the new order. The, the one who was simple before is now entering into a phase wherein the imperial protocol is affecting the church. The vestments, the clothing is now there. All of a sudden, they're using incense in their worship. Now, mind you, in the Jewish religion, they do use the incense in the temple. But the Christians, because they worship Christ, they no longer do the incense. In fact, they don't even do the offering of sacrifices to um, in the temple, in the tent of meetings. So that's not used anymore. But all of a sudden, they're using this because this is popular in the empire. Why is it popular? Because it's being used to do the offering to the idols of the gods and goddesses of Rome. The communion table used to be a simple wooden table, not really important. What is important is the one that you're remembering there. But now they're shifting it to an altar. Has to be a grand one. You see this altar in the 5th century found at Acreol near France, and you would see the elegant setting, which is actually, of course, influenced by Roman architecture. Kneeling was never done in Christian churches. And the reason for this is not because they are being proud, but Sunday is a celebration service. Sunday is a day where you proclaim that you have been adopted into the family of God. And so it's more about communing with the Lord instead of bowing homage. It's less, how I would say it's less liturgical, more casual and friendly. But kneeling is a Roman gesture of paying respect to the emperor, who happens to be in the Roman religion one of the gods. And so if you do it for the emperor, you should be doing it to the elders, and you should be doing it to symbols of faith. And so kneeling became important. The mother of Constantine also likes relics of the martyrs. And along with that, the influence of the altars having a martyr's bone is important. They would say that in some churches in the Orthodox Church, I think I spoke to someone who was from an Orthodox church in Egypt, and he was boasting about every altar of our churches have a saint's bones in it. Many of the modern Catholic churches have nothing like that. So ours is more holy. So, well, that's not really a Christian pattern. It's more of the imperial pattern in Rome. And then the other thing is the catechumenate, wherein Christians were asked to, you want to become a Christian, study the faith a year or two before you get baptized. Well, catechumenate has ended. Now it becomes easy Christianity. You want to become a Christian? Simply be baptized, and there you go. But the problem with this is now you have people who do not really know the faith, but are considered Christians. And if they're good in talking, they used to be former priests and priestesses in the temples of the gods and goddesses of Rome, they can easily rise up into authority. And so that would speed up arrogance and corruption in the Christian church. Here's another impact of the new order. Imperial structures enter the church. Do you know that the design of early Catholic churches are actually based from the imperial buildings, the design of the Roman Empire? This is one of the shape of typical basilica or a church building in Rome. And this is the same design that the imperial buildings are built. So the center part is called the nave, and this is where the pews are. There'll be smaller pews in the aisles, and this is the altar, and this is shaped uh, such that there would be, nice windows there that would attract light. Old churches are really nice, but those are really Roman Empire influence. Those are imperial designs. It's not necessarily Christian, but somehow the imperial structure is now entering into Christian buildings because, of course, Constantine and the other emperors after him have shown favor to the Christian church. And so not only are they wearing the clothes of the emperor, they're also having nice buildings that are similar to imperial buildings. And who would not want to become an elder in a big church with this? So much power. And so now arrogance and corruption becomes more rampant. This is a picture of an ancient basilica somewhere in Europe. If you've been in Italy, if you've been to the city of Rome or any other ancient cities in Italy, you would note that all the old churches are really similar in design. And you would know what I mean with this design. Here's another thing that changed. Baptism shifted from immersion. So used to be, it was like how Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan, by immersion. It's the same picture that later on Paul would describe. You have died with Christ and have been resurrected with Christ, and so you now live a new life. Well, it started to become boring because it's inconvenient to baptize by immersion so many people. So they would have a pool like this, and the person would kneel down, get wet there, and then they will be poured water on. But later on, because many people are being converted to faith, not necessarily because they believe, but because it has become an institutionalized religion in the empire, pouring gave way to dabbing. So no longer are you required to become a catechumen. Uh, you don't need to be immersed either. You don't need to be poured water into. Now we can do dabbing. And so nowadays we see this in babies, wherein a little pouring of water in the forehead and that's it, basically dabbing. So that's one of the things that has changed in the church, all because of the new order that was started by Constantine. What else happened? Well, another thing that has happened is the official theology and organized religion has now come into play. One of the things that they said is that Constantine truly was favored by God so that Christianity would grow. Now, we do know that Constantine was not necessarily a Christian during the time that he was reigning. He actually got baptized on his deathbed when he was about to die. He doesn't want to get baptized before because he was also considered a god in the Roman religion, being the emperor. Later on, he would become a hero of the Roman gods and goddesses because um, he's a leader of that side of the Roman Empire. So this is something that is a problem, but having said that, it became an official theology in the organized religion, which is now turning into, of course, the Catholic Church at this point. What was the response to this? The response to this is some Christians felt that the church is now so corrupt that they don't want to be associated with it. So some of them went to the mountains and simply meditated on the faith and adopted asceticism. So asceticism is they refuse to enjoy pleasure. They live in a simple life. And later on, this part is actually more of a solo practice. They wouldn't take a bath. They would just stay and pray and meditate in one place. Sometimes they would smell so bad, they would not eat, they would not have any property. And yet, some Christians were attracted to these people who are so focused on the faith, even though they have been isolating themselves and so on. Some people decided to group as people living in meditation and isolation, and that was called monasticism. So these are the monks. They would live as a society separated from others. They would have a vow of poverty and simplicity and so on. Others did not go this way, but they wanted to live as a simple church. So they would have the original, worship in homes, worship in catacombs. But it's becoming hard and hard because the organized church wanted to control all this. Later on, even the catacombs will be influenced by the church. When you go to Italy and you get the chance to visit catacombs, you would realize that churches are built on top of the catacombs. So how can simple Christians have a simple church if the places where they used to worship is now under uh, a building structure? So it's going to be really difficult. There are also intellectual activities happening. There will be people who will be called early church fathers, and they will be writing philosophy and thoughts about Christianity. One example of these is Saint Augustine, who is truly against catechumens. His idea is that it's making it hard for Christians for new believers to become Christians because you have to wait for a year or two. So he was actually in favor of making it the easy way, which is infant baptism. So it's like, is catechumen really needed? Maybe not. Let's make it easy for others. So that's what's happening in the church. And sad to say, that has led to the persecuted now becoming the persecutor. Even the term pagans is a sign of Christians now gaining power. The word pagan is not really used. It was only Roman religions, gods and goddesses of Rome. They were never called pagans, but the Christians, because now they're organized, they call them pagans or paganus. It's like a derogatory term for those who do not worship Christ. So now you know that they have gained power. So here's my final slide for you. I just want to ask you, if we will go back to the simple church, the simplicity of the early church, what would it look like? Think about the churches that we see nowadays. Are we closer to the Imperial church? Are we closer to the simple church? Here's another question. Are there positive gains for the church during the Constantinian era? There's something that we should be thankful about. And then lastly, at some point, the church that was persecuted became a persecutor. You'll see this again later on in history, the Crusades, the Roman Inquisition. Let me ask you now, how is the church being a persecutor today? So that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to open it for a few questions for those of you who have questions right now.